On a rain-dark morning in October 1943, at a wind-battered airfield in eastern England, Flight Lieutenant James Carter watched a brand-new aircraft taxi out like a promise made of metal. The program had cost the government millions, the briefings were full of confidence, and the squadron had been told they were receiving a machine designed for the real war: range, altitude, firepower, modern engineering. Then the weather did what enemy fighters couldn't. A thin, steady drizzle seeped into seams, fogged optics, and turned the cockpit into a cold glass box. Minutes after takeoff, the radio crackled with panic: intermittent power, instruments flickering, engine temperature rising for no reason anyone could explain. One aircraft turned back, then another. A third overshot the runway on landing because the controls felt stiff and delayed. No bullets, no flak, just British weather and a plane that was supposed to be ready. This was the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, a fighter the Allies invested in heavily because it looked unbeatable on paper. A giant of a machine with a massive radial engine, turbo-supercharging for altitude, and enough ruggedness to return home full of holes. It had been sold as reliability itself, industrial power given wings. But in the wet, cold, unpredictable skies of wartime Europe, early operations exposed a different truth. The aircraft could be powerful and still be fragile in the one thing war never negotiates with: conditions. By 1942, Allied planners were asking for an aircraft that could do everything the war demanded: escort bombers deep into hostile airspace, fight at altitude, survive damage, and still land on muddy forward fields. There were gaps in the current force: range limitations, altitude performance problems, and the simple fact that enemy defenses were improving faster than airframes were being replaced. So procurement pressure became relentless. The next fighter wasn't just supposed to be good. It was supposed to be a solution. The Thunderbolt arrived with the kind of specifications that make procurement officers fall in love. It was fast, heavily armed, and built around the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp, a monster of a radial engine that could take punishment and still run. Combined with a complex turbo-supercharger system, it promised altitude performance that would keep pace with the air war as it climbed higher and got deadlier. Its armament, 8.50 caliber machine guns, was a wall of fire. Its structure looked like a flying safe: thick, strong, engineered for survival. In presentations and briefings, it was described like an inevitability. With American industrial output behind it, it felt like the kind of aircraft you could mass-produce into victory. The pre-combat hype came naturally. Factory lines rolled. Photographs showed clean aircraft and confident crews. Reports praised its speed and firepower. The Thunderbolt wasn't framed as a risky innovation. It was framed as American certainty made operational. Pilots heard it could dive away from anything. Commanders heard it could escort bombers and still dominate fighters. Mechanics heard it was built tough. And because the war needed that to be true, everyone wanted to believe. There were reasons the belief hardened into near religion. The manufacturer had credibility, the engine had a reputation, and the aircraft's raw construction inspired confidence. The government didn't just approve it, they committed to it. Training systems adapted. Spares chains grew. Units reorganized around its capabilities. And once that happens, failure becomes more than an engineering problem. It becomes an institutional threat. Then the aircraft met European weather, not a laboratory, not a sunny test field, but a soaked, freezing world where moisture gets into everything, and cold turns small tolerances into big consequences. The first operational months revealed that rugged doesn't mean simple. The Thunderbolt's performance depended on systems that were technically brilliant and operationally demanding. The turbo-supercharger, essential for altitude power, added plumbing, ducting, controls, and complexity. In warm, controlled tests, it was manageable. In cold, damp airfields and long sorties through layered weather, small issues became cascading failures. Moisture could seep into electrical connections. Condensation could form where it shouldn't. Instruments could behave erratically. A minor fault that would be a note in a test report could become a mission abort in combat. The cockpit environment punished pilots too. At altitude, cold wasn't discomfort, it was impairment. Canopies could fog. Oxygen systems had to be trusted absolutely. Visibility mattered because a second of uncertainty in cloud can become a mid-air collision or a lost formation. And the very weather that made interception difficult also made navigation unforgiving. A powerful aircraft does not help you if you can't see your leader, can't trust your instruments, and can't rely on your systems to behave consistently in rain, ice, and freezing air. The engine itself was not the weak point. Radials were famously tough, but the aircraft's operational ecosystem was. Fuel and air systems could be affected by cold. Carburation and mixture management demanded discipline. Any inconsistency in maintenance, any rushed line check, any moisture left sitting in connectors, any imperfect seal after repeated ground cycles could show up in the air like a betrayal. And because early Thunderbolt units were learning all of this in real time, with real missions and real consequences, the aircraft gained a reputation that wasn't captured by the promotional photographs. It was demanding, heavy, and when the weather turned, it could feel unforgiving. Then the accidents began to shape perception. A fighter doesn't need to be bad to be dangerous. It only needs to be unpredictable in the conditions it is forced to operate in. Some aircraft returned with electrical anomalies. Others struggled in icing. Some pilots experienced control stiffness in cold air that made landings feel wrong. A few aircraft were lost not because the enemy beat them, but because weather plus system complexity plus wartime tempo created a narrow corridor of safety that pilots had to hit perfectly every time. Mechanics fought their own war. They worked in wet darkness, hands in cold metal, trying to keep complex systems stable under constant strain. They checked ducting, adjusted controls, chased intermittent faults that vanished on the ground and returned in the air. But war doesn't pause for troubleshooting. If missions are scheduled, aircraft are expected. And that pressure can turn small maintenance uncertainties into operational risk. Pilots began writing reports that sounded less like enthusiasm and more like warnings. Not because the aircraft couldn't fight. When it was running right, it could be terrifyingly effective. But because the conditions under which it had to operate were not optional. Weather wasn't a side factor. It was the battlefield itself. And if an aircraft becomes unreliable when the battlefield appears, then its performance claims don't matter. The breaking point wasn't one dramatic explosion. It was repetition. Abort after abort, minor failures that kept happening. A growing sense among aircrews that success depended too much on luck, on whether the aircraft had been perfectly serviced, whether the day's moisture found the wrong connector, whether the climb passed through icing, whether the instrument stayed honest long enough to get everyone home. And in a few units, that fear hardened into refusal. Quietly at first, requests to switch aircraft, to trade sorties, to take a different role. Then more openly, pilots unwilling to take a machine into conditions where it had already proven it could fail without warning. Because the enemy was one thing, but weather is everywhere and you can't shoot it down. The institution responded the way institutions often do under pressure. It tried to manage the narrative, blame procedure, blame handling, blame maintenance discipline. Because admitting the aircraft struggled in real weather meant admitting that a massive investment had produced something that wasn't ready in the exact environment it was built to fight in. It meant acknowledging that specifications and controlled trials had not adequately simulated the worst reality. Wet airfields, icing layers, long sorties, rushed turnarounds, exhausted crews. But facts have weight, so the response became practical. Field modifications improved sealing and reliability. Maintenance protocols became stricter and more specialized. Training adapted to teach pilots how to manage complex systems under weather stress. Tactics shifted to use the aircraft where it was strongest and to avoid conditions that multiplied risk. Over time, units learned how to keep it alive and deadly. And that's the uncomfortable twist. The aircraft did not remain a failure. The Thunderbolt became one of the war's great workhorses, especially as a ground attack platform where its toughness, firepower, and diving speed were devastating. But that later success doesn't erase the early gap between expectation and reality. It doesn't erase the period when the program consumed money, time, and confidence while the weather exposed its operational weaknesses. The numbers, financial, operational, human, forced a lesson that outlives any single aircraft. Reliability is not a bragging point. It's the foundation. An aircraft can be fast, heavily armed, and structurally strong, and still be unfit for war if it cannot tolerate the environment in which war takes place. The engineering lesson was harsh and simple. Systems must be tested the way they will be used, not in ideal skies, not in clean conditions, in rain, in cold, in ice, with hurried turnarounds and tired crews, because that is war's laboratory and it never gives you a second attempt. The institutional lesson was even harsher. Procurement momentum can become a trap. When millions are spent and reputations are attached, organizations tend to defend the program before they defend the people flying it. Early warnings get softened, failures get rationalized, and the cost accumulates until denial becomes impossible. In the end, the story of this plane is not a story of a bad idea. It's a story of a powerful idea pushed into service before it had been proven in the only test that matters, real conditions. It looked invincible because the war demanded something invincible, but reality demanded something else. It demanded an aircraft that could survive weather, and for a time, this one couldn't. If you want, I can also write an alternate version of the same structure using a different aircraft that is even more tightly, weather failure centered, like a carrier aircraft plagued by corrosion and salt spray, or an early high-altitude interceptor that collapsed in cold icing, while keeping the same documentary tone and single-flow narration.